very much indeed, Viv, and thanks for inviting me to speak at this meeting, because what we've seen last week at the UN in New York is a quite remarkable development in terms of disarmament, in terms of nuclear affairs, and in terms of diplomacy more generally, because what we've seen there is the beginning of negotiations by the UN to draw up a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. Now this treaty, these developments have come about not because the nuclear weapons states have said we have incredibly dangerous, expensive arsenals, we've been committed for 40 years under the NPT to getting rid of them, let's do something about it. No, on the contrary, these developments, these negotiations have started because the rest of the world, the countries that don't have nuclear weapons, don't want them and think they should be got rid of, have finally lost patience and taken matters into their own hands. So I'm just going to just start off by saying how that process came about, if that's all right to cover that.
Yeah, please.
And then I'll go on and talk about what actually happened last week, because there were some very interesting developments, and then I'll just conclude by saying what the next steps are that are taking place. So the process began in earnest 7 years ago. In 2010, there was the regular review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Every 5 years, the countries get together at the UN to discuss what progress has been made. As you can imagine, there's a lot of talking, but not actually anything very much comes out of it. And so that was the first time that the countries that had lost patience began to really try and put this ban treaty on the agenda. And in the final statement from that conference, it was talked about deep concern at catastrophic humanitarian consequences, and therefore the impact that that could have on all the states that don't have nuclear weapons. So that was the beginning of what became known as the humanitarian process. And what happened was that on a kind of regular basis, the countries that wanted to see movement began to issue statements asking countries to get together, to start talking about the ban treaty, and also looking in more depth into what would actually happen if nuclear weapons were used. Now, sometimes people say, oh, well, we all know that nuclear weapons are bad, we saw what happened at Hiroshima, how can you tell us anything new about the humanitarian consequences? People thought that it was just old news. But in actual fact, there's been a lot of recent research, scientific research, that's shown that the consequences, even of a relatively small nuclear exchange, could be absolutely catastrophic for the planet. And that is because the scientific evidence now shows that even just a small exchange would reduce the temperature of the planet quite significantly. Therefore, food production would be impossible across large parts of the world, and millions of people, if not over 1 billion people, would die of starvation. And very likely, the people that were dying from starvation would be from the countries that didn't have nuclear weapons. You know, so they were feeling that they were being put at risk by a very small number of irresponsible countries who were insisting on continuing with nuclear weapons. So there were conferences in Oslo, in Nayarit, in Mexico, and then in 2014 there was a conference held in Vienna to discuss taking this forward. And out of that conference there was what became known as the Austrian Pledge, which was that the international community would pursue legal means of prohibiting and eliminating nuclear weapons. So it would go from being like a demand and a desire and an aspiration to actually being concrete legal steps which would end nuclear weapons for all time. So from that conference, it then went to the United Nations General Assembly That was in December 2015, and that General Assembly adopted the pledge as a resolution. So it became a UN General Assembly resolution. 83% of the countries in the UN General Assembly voted for negotiations to take place. So overwhelming majority of the international community was then on side. Then things grew apace very quickly. They agreed to have what was called an open-ended working group. That worked last year in 2016 to put some more details together. And in October 2016, there was a vote to begin those ban treaty negotiations, and that's what happened last week. Now, of course, I've been talking about all the countries who wanted that to happen. There was also a number of countries who didn't want that to happen, as you can imagine. Interestingly, not all the nuclear weapon states actually voted against having ban treaty negotiations. So at the UN General Assembly last year, the US, the UK, Russia and France all voted against treaty negotiations. China, India and Pakistan abstained, and North Korea voted in favour of ban treaty negotiations. So they were operating as a kind of bloc. So that's been quite interesting. But most of the nuclear weapon states voted against, and also they began to put enormous pressure on other countries not to support the ban treaty process. Virtually all of the NATO states, for example, were told in no uncertain terms not to vote in favour of the treaty. Other countries in kind of other military alliances or bilateral relations with the US also were kind of prevented from supporting the treaty, like Japan, for example, some of the other countries in the Southern Hemisphere, and so on. So that process began. But still, nevertheless, they weren't able to get a bloc of more than about 30 or 40 states to actually stand in the way of the treaty. So that's where it was up until the beginning of last week. CND, and I'm sure many of you, have been putting pressure on our government to attend. Having voted against it, nevertheless, they were still entitled to attend and participate. And in actual fact, if they'd participated, they could have expressed their concerns and brought different aspects to the table, but they didn't even want to do that. They maintained all along that they felt that the process would be damaging to the NPT. Okay, not quite sure how that works out, but they did. Now, one of the things we've seen very regularly from our government, not just this one, but all previous ones, is they all say, of course we're in favour of multilateral disarmament. You know, we don't agree with CND because they want to get rid of Trident or something, but we favour the multilateral process. We want global disarmament all at the same time. So they're given the opportunity to participate in a global multilateral process, but still they say no. You know, so that our task, we've seen, has been to get them to come to the table. But they continue to say, no, sorry, we need what they call a step-by-step process. And this is the kind of dichotomy that we've seen emerging throughout the process. On the one hand, the majority who say, we want to have a global ban, we need to draw the treaty up and then win people to sign it. And on the other hand, most of the nuclear weapons states who say, no, that's bad, you know, that's dangerous. They say it's dangerous without really explaining why. And they say we need to continue the step-by-step process towards disarmament. Now, if there was a step-by-step process, that would be fine, you know, we could all support that. But that hasn't been in the offing. And as we know, the only step our government is actually taking is to replace Trident, you know, going in the wrong direction. So last Monday, all these countries gathered together, and in fact, even though the UK and the US and French and so on said they weren't coming, and didn't actually go into the negotiating chamber. What they did do was come along and held a press conference just outside the negotiating chamber. So there was Nikki Haley, she's President Trump's new ambassador to the UN. She held this press conference. On one side there was the French ambassador, on the other side there was Matthew Rycroft, who's the British ambassador, and they all explained why it was a very bad thing, kind of denounced to the negotiations going on inside, you know. I mean, if he'd gone there, Matthew Rycroft had actually gone there, why didn't he just go into the room and at least listen? But one of the most popular photos from the whole of last week was the UK chair in the negotiating chamber empty. So this went viral, whatever it was, on Twitter and so on, this empty chair. Anyway, that's unfortunate. But anyway, there were very positive things that went on. So I'll just briefly run through some of the key things which were discussed. So first of all, there were speeches on the general principles, why countries were supporting the initiative, the principles they thought should be enshrined in any potential treaty. And then there were also messages of support from international institutions and prominent figures. So the Pope, for example, he sent a message saying it was an exercise of hope. He's very supportive of the ban process. The International Red Cross, which has been very supportive from a medical humanitarian perspective, they sent a message saying it was of historical significance. So those kind of very important civil society things are on side. Then the states, the different states from across the world began to make their contributions. So just to give you a sample of who spoke: Austria, Costa Rica, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, Egypt, Chile, Morocco, Ethiopia, New Guinea, you know, the whole kind of representative, particularly very strongly from the global south, most of which is of course organised in nuclear weapons free zones. So strong anti-nuclear sentiment. There were calls for the ban to complement the NPT, because as we know, the NPT says what should happen, but it doesn't say how you get to disarmament. So a lot of people see the ban treaty as something which will complement the NPT by putting the process in place. The only dissenting voice at the start was Japan. As I just said, they opposed the ban negotiations, but they were the only country which opposed them that actually came along. So they came along on the first day. It's not quite sure why they chose to do that, possibly because of their strong kind of moral authority in the kind of nuclear weapons situation, because they're the only country that's been nuked. But they said that without the nuclear weapons states involved from the start, the divisions in the international community would grow. So they came to kind of offer this kind of cautious voice saying that it would be damaging. And then they didn't come back after day one. So that was a kind of unusual angle to the day. And then there was a lot of debate about what should be included in the treaty. What sort of things should be made illegal. So things people suggested were things like transportation, stockpiling, transfer of weapons, weapons testing, development of weapons, financing of weapons, and of course use of nuclear weapons. So there's, I mean, in terms of what kind of treaty we might see, some people favour a very minimal treaty, which just bans one or two things. And then others want to have something which is quite detailed and covers all the different areas. So that's still up for discussion. Now then, interestingly, on the second day, the Netherlands spoke. Now, the Netherlands was the only NATO state to actually participate in the conference, and that is because their government was forced to send someone because of a vote in the Dutch Parliament. So they had to. And they came up with this very bizarre position. They called for the treaty to be compatible with NATO's posture on this question. Now, NATO's got a nuclear first use policy. You know. Anyway, they were there, that's good. But they also called again for this step-by-step approach. So they were there sort of reinforcing the step-by-step thing. One aspect of the conference over the number of days was the engagement of civil society organisations, and that's been very strongly recognised. In fact, a number of the state contributions said how useful and positive that was. And it was slightly different from the way that civil society participates in the NPT conferences, where they can have fringe meetings and then they can listen in on some things, but they're kind of on the sides. This conference was specifically organised by the UN through its resolution in such a way that there was interaction between civil society and the delegates, and that civil society could input, you know, expert ideas and advice and all that sort of thing. So there was quite a strong interchange. That was very, very important. CND had a fringe meeting, and the interesting thing there was that we were able to invite Fabian Hamilton MP, who is Labour's shadow Peace and Disarmament Minister. So he was the only British politician who was actually there participating. So he was able to join in that, and of course, because he's a shadow minister and all that sort of thing, then the British ambassador would see him, although of course he wouldn't see the CND delegation itself. But anyway, that was very good that that presence was there. So, having done their formal statements, they then went on to more in-depth discussions throughout the week. And I'll just give you a sample of 2 or 3 of the types of contributions that were made. So, Sweden, for example, raised the need to protect the right to develop nuclear energy. As you know, within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 3rd pillar of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is that countries should have the right to access to civil nuclear power, you know, for peaceful energy purposes, alongside, you know, its requirements for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. So there's concern from some states that the ban treaty doesn't kind of clamp down on nuclear energy production. So that's going to be an ongoing discussion. That was something which was supported by Iran. You know, Iran, as we know, has fought to maintain its right to develop nuclear civil energy. So there's obviously going to be a clump of states that want to, you know, bring that to the fore, that right to the fore. Then Ireland spoke. Ireland's had a very long, strong record, you know, in anti-nuclear weapons work. So they've got kind of high status in the discussion framework. They spoke on nuclear testing and the need to, as well as outlawing all testing, the need to ban computer simulation models. So you may know that at Aldermaston, for example, and where we work with the French on nuclear weapons testing, they do it now through simulating through computer models. I've no idea how they do that, but anyway, that's what they do. But Ireland and others are calling for a ban on that, even though it doesn't actually use fissile material. They're calling for a ban on that, because I suppose you could have a kind of side channel going on where things are being sort of developed technologically outside of the ban. So they want to have a cap on that. Talking of testing, there was also a strong strand in support of the victims, not only of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the victims of nuclear weapons testing. So, you know, strong mention was made of that, and there were also participants there who are hibakusha survivors from Japan, but also people who've survived nuclear radiation and accidents and so on from other places as well, like Kazakhstan, for example. So there was a strong tribute paid to those people. Then Venezuela called for a ban on security doctrines that justify the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. So they want to expand the remit of the treaty into restrictions on what comes in security doctrines. And of course that has implications for us, the UK, as well as other NATO states, because as I said, you know, NATO is predicated on being a nuclear armed alliance with a first use policy. So that is going to be constrained as well. A draft treaty is expected to be produced in May. Okay, so they finished the first week of discussions. There will be a draft treaty probably in May. The PrepCom, the NPT PrepCom, is taking place in the first 2 weeks of May, so the draft is expected after that. And at the moment, no one knows whether the ban treaty stuff is going to come up at the NPT, because it's almost as if now there are sort of two things running parallel. Will there be a kind of interaction between the two? We don't know. The draft will be written by the chair of the conference, who comes from Costa Rica. Costa Rica, as you may know, has a very kind of high standing in this area as well, not only because they don't have an army, they chose many decades ago not to have an army, but they've also played a leading role in nuclear disarmament stuff. They were the country which put a draft convention, nuclear weapons convention, to the UN in the 1990s. So they've got a very strong track record. So Elaine White Gomez, she is the chair, and she is going to be drawing up the draft treaty. So she has a very high reputation. People think that she's very skilled. She's been involved with other treaties that have been very successful. So people think that if anyone can do it, you know, pull these different perspectives together, that she can do that. So the next round is June the 15th to July the 7th. Our pressure at the moment is going to still be on our government to send somebody along, so I think we should continue to put that kind of pressure through our campaigning work. And then another thing impacting on our campaigning, 2 days after the opening of that conference, on June the 17th, which is a Saturday, there's been a call from I think particularly women in the peace movement. I'm not sure where this originated, with WILP perhaps, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. The 17th is going to be a global day of action in support of the ban. So C&D happens to have a national conference on that day about nuclear power and opposition to nuclear power. So obviously we will be mentioning nuclear weapons in that context, but we're also encouraging local groups and supporters, maybe if they're having a stall, to have a global ban theme on the stall, or to have a vigil or some kind of particular action on that day to support this global day of action. So that's the task for us. Once there is a treaty, and there's no doubt there will be a treaty, the task then will be to get the nuclear weapon states to sign up, you know, and that is going to be where the really difficult part starts, you know, getting our government to participate. But that is the opportunity that we have. This is the best opportunity we've had for a very long time. The global majority is for nuclear disarmament, and they are not any longer going to take it lying down. Thanks very much.